Hello again, students. I'm Christopher Hanlon. I'm a professor of English at Eastern Illinois University, and I'm bringing you the Close Reading Cooperative for this week, the podcast in literary studies produced here at Eastern Illinois University. Now, last week, we talked about this whole subject of scansion, and we learned some new terms, right? We learned that scansion is a way to observe, make observations about, and to talk about the sound of poetry. We learned that lines of verse poetry are divided into feet, which are sets of multiple syllables. And we learned that iambs are feet that consist of two syllables, where the stress comes at the end. And we learned that trochees are feet that also consist of two syllables, but with the stress at the beginning. And today I wanted to sort of ask the rhetorical question, well, so what? Right? I mean, how does knowing that kind of stuff help us to really make observations about meaning in literature? And the thing I want to suggest to you is that scansion is really valuable because it is a way for us to talk about how form helps to shape meaning. And that is really where the rubber hits the road for English majors, right? We don't talk simply about what literature means, we talk about how it means as English majors, and scansion is a great way to do that. So I want to take up a line that we discussed last time, and that's a line from Emily Dickinson. I'm going to put it on the screen here once again. Much madness is divine as sense. Now, as Francine McGregor told us last time, if we were to scan this line, that is to divide the syllables into feet, and here we do that, and then we make our scansion marks over those syllables to note that the accent always falls on the second syllable, much madness is divine as sense, we see right away, okay, that this is an iambic poem. And we can go a little further than that, right? We can say that not only are the feet iambic, but since there are four of those feet, right, this is a certain kind of meter called quadrammeter. So this first line of this poem is iambic quadrammeter. But then we go to the second line, right, and we take a look how this line scans. To a discerning eye. Let's divide that up into feet and take a moment and observe for yourself where the stresses fall. We can see that once again we're dealing with an iambic line, to a discerning eye. But now we only have 3 feet, right? So that second line would be called iambic trimeter. Now this is an interesting thing to note about this particular poem because that meter, iambic quadrammeter followed by iambic trimeter and alternating back and forth like that was a really, really common meter back in the 19th century when Dickinson was writing her poems. In fact, it was so common that it had a name, common hymn meter. Right? So right away in this poem, Dickinson establishes herself as working within this very recognizable form, common hymn meter. And the key for us, as people who know how to scan, is to then ask, well, does she simply follow that meter or does she mess around with it at all? Does she play with it? And to what end, if she does? So let's keep going here. Okay, so first 2 lines, iambic quadrammeter, followed by iambic trimeter. And now let's look at the third line. Much sense, the starkest madness. Now, to my ear, something's wrong there. Something doesn't sound quite right. And in fact, if we scan this line, we can identify what's wrong. Let's divide the syllables into feet once again. Much sense, the starkest madness. Well, we can see right away that there's something different. Right? At the end of the line, we don't have a complete foot. We only have 1 syllable. And in fact, there's a name for that. When writers of poetry cut off the last syllable from the last foot of the line, that's a technique known as catalexis. Right? So we might say that this is a catalectic line insofar as it's missing its last syllable. And that produces a certain sound effect. Right? I mean, something is wrong in the line insofar as we've been set up to expect quadrammeter here and we don't get it. It is iambic, right? But again, once again, that last foot doesn't quite deliver on the full sound that we're waiting for. Now we snap back into the meter, into common hymn meter, with the last line, "'Tis the majority." Right? Now we're back into iambic trimeter. But that third line, where something's wrong, something's missing, the interesting thing here is that when we look at the words of the poem, we realize that the form here is commenting upon that form, isn't it? I mean, what's the stanza about? Dickinson is describing this process whereby madness, right, is in fact equivalent to divine sense, as she says, to a discerning eye. Well, what is the language of this stanza about? Well, Dickinson's describing a process, right, whereby madness and sense sometimes seem equivalent, as she puts it, to a discerning eye. That is this rarefied perspective from which you can see that sense and madness are sometimes kind of not as distinguishable as we'd like to think. But in the third line, she's talking about something much more particular than that, right? Let's look back at the poem. Much sense the starkest madness describes a process whereby sense and madness get sort of exchanged, right? Madness kind of gets passed off as sense. There's something wrong when that happens. And the something wrong that's happening in the language of the poem gets reflected or reiterated in the something wrong in the meter of the poem, right? That cacophony, that little hiccup that the poem lets out at the end when we're missing that last syllable, right? And so, that's one way in which the meter of this poem helps to not only reflect the meaning of the poem, but actually to help shape it, right? And that's the kind of thing that we're always looking for as we're scanning lines of poetry. So this week, as you're reading poetry in your classes, I want you to try to do that, right? Find places where the meter of these poems breaks down, or, some kind of expectation, a metrical expectation, gets set up only to be tampered with or messed with later on, and in ways that might help to shape the meaning of the poem. Okay, well, I think that's enough for this week, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week with the Close Reading Cooperative.